I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop, aka the boardroom. So in this video I'm going to be building a bench seat, and it is one piece in a larger commission. And as with all jobs, I start by unloading some materials. Start with a shot of my working drawings. For small projects I don't put a ton of effort into these, really just some drawings with basic dimensions. Clear as mud, right? Alright, so here you're looking at the brains of my shop, and that is a clipboard that I keep all of my notes, receipts, and drawings on. And this may seem like a small thing, but it's not. I put the clipboard on a piece of 1/4-inch melamine, and that's important because as you can see in this shot, I can balance the clipboard in my sliding table saw and also on the fence on my chop saw. And this really helps me stay organized when I'm cutting out parts. So after breaking down a couple of sheets of plywood, it was time to apply some solid wood edge banding, which I do with Titebond 3 and some homemade spring clamps. And if you're interested in how I made these spring clamps, check out my channel and you'll find a video titled Built-in Cabinet, TV Console, and Floating Shelves. And I talk a little bit more about the process of making these. And I know that you can buy this type of clamp, but I felt like that was a little cost prohibitive. I ended up making 100 of these clamps for a little less than 150 bucks. So after the glue is dry, I'm using a lipping planer to flush up the edge banding to the surface of the plywood. And in this shot, I'm doing what's referred to as a climb cut, and that's basically where the direction of the cutter is forcing the tool back at you. And it's a little bit more dangerous to use the tool this way, but it does give a cleaner cut. And I hold the tool in such a way that as I make the first pass, it doesn't quite cut all the way flush. Then I come back and use a little more pressure over the cutter to flush things up perfectly. And here I'm using my biscuit joiner with a special fence attached to it to flush trim the ends of the edge banding. This biscuit joiner is made by Lamello, and they call it the Top 20. I don't know why they call it the Top 20, but I think recently it was replaced by a newer model that's the Top 21. And now I've moved on to cutting the joinery for the two cases that will make up the structure of this bench seat. I like to sand all of the inside surfaces prior to assembly. Alright, you're witnessing the first actual help I've received from the shop apprentice. And he came up with this idea all on his own here. I think this was overkill, but I assembled these cabinets with biscuits and glue, some staples, and I followed that up with some screws. And if you don't know, that is referred to as the hat trick of cabinet making. Here I'm attaching an additional fence to the biscuit joiner, and it helps balance the tool when you're using it in a vertical orientation or when you're using it on narrow stock. And I attach the bottoms in the same way with biscuits glue, screws, and nails. So if you've noticed the two interesting looking lanterns over my shoulder and you want to know more about how I built them, take a look at my channel and you'll find a build video. So if you're wondering why I built this bench seat in two halves, the reason is it's a little over 8 feet long, and building two independent boxes and joining them together seemed easier than trying to splice plywood. And here's my method for marrying the two halves together: biscuits and glue. Anytime you're joining two boxes like this, the chances of everything lining up perfectly are basically zero. So I add a little chamfer and it just creates a small shadow line that kind of hides the seam between the two boxes. Next it was time to glue and clamp the two halves together. A couple deep reach clamps and plenty of glue, and this thing's solid as a rock. Once the two halves were built and joined together, it was time to turn my attention to building, I guess, what we'll refer to in this video as a face frame. As I mentioned earlier, the piece is a little more than 8 feet wide, so I was able to order 10-foot material here so that the face frame can be one piece and I don't have to do any odd splices. So the flip stop on my chop saw station only goes out to 8 feet. So here's how I deal with cutting longer material, and that is I just make sure to hold them tightly together and cut them both at the same time. And really I do the same thing for layout. I make sure the pieces are lined up on the ends and make the marks on both parts at the same time. Use the EdgeTech sanding disc to clean up all the inside edges prior to assembly. So when I'm gluing pieces together that are going to be joined with biscuits, I like to make sure to get a little bit of glue on both sides of the slot. I think that's really important to getting a good connection. And for this kind of work, there really is no better tool than a good biscuit joiner. They're fast, they're consistent, and they're easy to use. It doesn't really take a lot of thought when using a biscuit joiner to get very good results. And the resulting joint is very strong. And one light pass on each side through the wide belt sander just to clean up any small discrepancies in the joinery. Alright, now it's time to cut the miters for the two side pieces and the front piece. I was back to the EdgeTech just to clean up the top edge before gluing all of these parts to the case. So I also chamfer the seam between this front face frame and the box. Alright, time for some more biscuits. I'm guessing you're sensing a theme at this point. But in this case, I'm really not using the biscuits for strength. I'm using them for alignment during glue up. Sure does make glue ups less stressful when you don't have two pieces slipping around on each other. Here I just have the two side pieces temporarily clamped in place, and I find that doing this helps line up the location of this front piece before committing and nailing it down. Once the front piece is clamped and glued in place, it's real easy to come back and adjust the side pieces ever so slightly and glue and nail those in place as well. And here I'm just adding some plywood strips that will act as the feet. These will also act as the support for the base molding that's going to be wrapped around the bottom. And since I'll be attaching the base molding to these strips, I wanted them to be aligned perfectly with the front face. And since this bench seat will be sitting on top of wood floors, at some point after I'm done with the build, I'm going to attach some anti-skid rubber feet. Alright, now I'm working on the back of the bench, and this will be pushed up against a wall, but even still I wanted to cover up the edges of the plywood. And doing this will also cover up the screws as well as the seam between the two boxes that I've joined together. Alright, at this point the box is basically built, so I decided to turn my attention to building the lids. So you might be wondering why I chose to move on to building the lids rather than attaching the base molding to the box and sanding and routing and things like that. And the reason for this is drying time. I knew I needed to edge band the lids, so I wanted to get those clamped up and drying as quickly as I could and keep the project moving forward. So I milled up a chunk of lumber and ripped off a few strips. So in my opinion, I think that the jointer and the bandsaw should be very close to each other. And I say this because I do as much ripping at the bandsaw as possible. And I like to use the bandsaw because it creates a little bit less dust and it is much safer than the table saw. So for edge banding, door parts, or face frame parts, this is kind of my standard operating procedure to bounce back and forth between the jointer and the bandsaw. And I'm clamping this up with a jointed face against the edge of the plywood, and the bandsawn face will be sanded later. Alright, now that the edge banding is drying, it's time to turn my attention back to the main box, and I give it a quick sanding prior to attaching the base molding. And I do this because it's just much easier to sand that surface than it would be to sand up against the edge of the base molding. Once the pieces were cut to length, I could glue and tack them in place. If you find yourself watching more than one of my videos, I think you'll notice that I have a handful of tools that get used all the time, and these miter clamps are one of those tools. I really like them. They help lock miters shut, and I use them on most projects. So when possible, I like to leave my moldings long and then trim them off later. And I find this to be real convenient because then you don't need to worry about the miter cut and the length of the piece. You just worry about lining up the miter and then cut the piece to length later. Alright, just fitting the last of the edge banding for the lids. Once the edge banding was dry enough, I could use the lipping planer once again to flush everything up. Next, it was time to deal with some hardware. So I get these hinges from Rockler, and I think they're called like a torsion hinge. And basically what that means is there's some friction in the knuckle, and it prevents the lid from slamming. It actually kind of prevents the lid from closing under its own weight. You actually have to actively push the lid closed. And this project's going to be in a house with a couple of little kids. So I wanted to make sure that the lids weren't going to be chopping off any little fingers. I'm using a spacer and a jig to locate the pilot holes for these hinges. And I'm also using a VIX bit, which is a type of drill bit that helps center a pilot hole. Since people will be sitting on this, I wanted to make sure that the lid was touching the case all the way around. So here I'm just routing out the thickness of the hinge. And if you ever find yourself routing on a very thin piece of wood, I find that clamping a second sacrificial piece will really help balance the router. This tool is known as a center punch, and it's very much like a VIX bit, but instead of having a drill bit, it just has a little punch. And a center punch is a nice alternative to a VIX bit. Here's a nice close-up of a VIX bit, and you can see there's a spring-loaded drill bit inside that cone shape, which makes sure that you drill centered in the hinge hole. And here's a center punch, same thing, except it just leaves a mark as opposed to drilling a hole. And this is convenient if you don't have the right size VIX bit for the screw that you're using. Now it's time for a few finishing touches, just adding a round over here to the top edge. And it's always good to vacuum a project prior to finishing. And then it was time for some primer. I've been asked a few times about my spray setup, and it's a fairly simple setup. I have a 5 horsepower 60-gallon air compressor. I run the air through an air dryer and then to the spray gun, and I use a different spray gun for each type of material that I spray. If there's enough interest, I can put together a video on my process for spray finishing. So if that's something you'd like to see, let me know in the comment section below. My finishing schedule starts with 2 coats of shellac-based primer, and after the second coat, if any area looks a little thin, I'll throw a little extra primer on it at that point in time. When spraying water-based top coats, as I'll be doing on this project, it's very important to get a good primer base for 2 main reasons. First, if any moisture from the top coat seeps through the primer base, it can cause grain raising. And second, moisture behind the primer coat can cause adhesion problems. Alright, now it's time for 2 quick pro tips. 1, stir your water-based material about twice as much as you think you need to. And second, you want to run your material through a filter. And of course, here I'm just showing off my awesome shop-built filter stand. And this is my process for giving my right hand bone spurs and carpal tunnel. So if you didn't pick it up from the can, the top coat that I'm going to be spraying is Sherwin-Williams Chem Aqua. And it's described as a waterborne lacquer. And here's the reason I like to run all my material through a filter. For the most part, I like to work from least obvious face to most obvious face. So on this project, that means I'll start with the inside, then move to the back, then the sides, and then finish off with the front. And on the lids, that means doing the bottoms first and letting them completely dry, and then flipping over and doing the top. So I start with a light first coat, and I do this to introduce as little moisture to the surface of the wood as possible. I follow that up with a good sanding, and then I come back with a second heavier coat. And when and where possible, I like to let stuff sit for several days before touching it, just to make sure it's fully cured. So after a few days drying time, it's time to add some non-skid, non-marring feet, so that my beautiful piece doesn't ruin the beautifully brand new wood floors in the house this is going to be delivered to. For any larger project with a lid, I don't think that there is anything better than these hinges. They really have a nice smooth feel to them. At some point, the customer is going to have 2 cushions made for the top of this, and they're going to be attached with Velcro. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this bench is just one piece in a larger commission, and the next project that I'm going to be working on is a dining table, so stay tuned for that build video. In the end, I was really happy with the way this turned out. It's a simple project, but it was still really fun to build.